Good day, this is Paul Benjamin Lowry. This is part one of a lecture video series where I'd like to discuss how to connect an interdisciplinary research discourse to artifacts of theory. And this will help lead toward better theorizing in sciences of the artificial or interdisciplinary research. So first of all, I want to give primary content credit for inspiration for this presentation, primarily to work I've done with Nick Hassan and Lars Mathiasen, with a recent publication we had on the process of information systems theorizing as a discursive practice. And this was in the Journal of Information Technology, and a couple related companion pieces, including recent presentation work that Nick has done. So here's Nick Hassan. He's actually the department chair and associate professor of management information systems at the Lebovitz School of Business and Economics at the University of Minnesota Duluth. He's a great scholar, theorist, co-author, and friend. And aside from these works that I draw on and others, some additional thoughts of mine from my teaching experiences, teaching theory building, research workshops to PhD students, and to my theorizing practice as well. And except for the specific artifacts that I've borrowed and referenced via fair use at the end of the presentation, I am also responsible for creating the original design theory artifacts for this. Okay, so turning to the main paper I'm building on, basically in this paper, we argue that although there's a lot of growing understanding of theory in interdisciplinary fields like information systems, the actual process of how you create and generate original theory is largely missing. And so to fill this void, we look at the context of discovery and we emphasize creative and often serendipitous articulation of theory. And we really look at this important stage of theorizing in terms of being reflective and highly iterative. And so we look at the discourse and how to engage in the discourse and problematize and deploy various products, or what I prefer to call artifacts of theory, such as analogies, metaphors, myths, models, and to put this together in the overall discourse. So in the paper, we primarily refer to these pieces of theory or components of theory as products of theory. Again, my preference is to call it artifacts of theory, especially because I think it makes more sense to a lot of people in the sciences of artificial to think in terms of design artifacts. So probably the most important point I want to start with in terms of engaging in a discourse for theory building is to not confuse the models that we create with broader theory. This is often a problem in interdisciplinary research where researchers consider models alone as theory when it's just one of the artifacts or one of the components of theory instead. So again, a model is just one of the several artifacts or components of theory that create a broader theory. This is a really important understanding because when we think of the artifacts or the different components of theory, it helps us better know how to generate original theory in the discourses we're trying to engage in. So this leads to the most important question I have for you to think about today is, do you know your target interdisciplinary discourse? And what is this discourse? So a discourse is basically a set of rules that define how objects are studied in any field or discipline. More formally, a discursive formation is a set of rules that govern the formation of claims made concerning an object of study within the disciplinary activity which defines the nature of the field. Now, a, a good example of this is the biological discourse is about the rules of sustaining life. This gets tricky the more interdisciplinary we get because we could be crossing a couple disciplines or three disciplines or four disciplines, or the discourse that we're in may not actually be owned by a particular discipline. But knowing whom we are having conversations with and for what purpose is the point of understanding our interdisciplinary discourse. Well, just as a simple illustration, on one hand, we can have the psychology discourse for the broader discipline of psychology. Of course, there are many sub-discourses within this discourse, but these would be the rules surrounding representations of the mind, such as individual memory, consciousness, personality. Now, what other related discourse may there be to psychology that has slightly different rules that we don't want to confuse with psychology? One of several good answers to this question would be the discourse or the broader discipline of sociology. Sure, there's some relationship between these discourses, but look at how the rules are different. So we're looking at the rules for interaction between individuals. So social relationships, legitimacy, order, conflict, power, authority, coordination, control. So certainly there's overlaps because they both deal with the human, but psychology is more about the mind, more about cognition. It's more internal, and sociology, the discourse is more external. Now, if you overlap these two discourses, what do you get? You get social psychology, which is a fairly large discipline and associated discourse. And there are other disciplines and discourses, such as one that I've been classically trained in the field of communication, along with information systems, which has some other components that overlap in social psychology as well as other fields. So another example would be comparing the disciplines or large discourses of computer science on the left to information systems on the right. There's a similar parallel between these and psychology and sociology in that computer science is much more inwardly focused around the computer, the algorithms, the processing, engineering algorithms, often with a core reference discipline in mathematics. And to really get into the scientific computation. With information systems, it's a little more of an outward focus in this discourse. So it's a socio-technical intersection of computers, systems, organizations, people, processes, supply chains, and decision making. So the reference disciplines or other discourses that IS people get into are more likely to include economics, psychology, social psychology. Now, do computer science and information systems overlap in their discourses? Well, yes, definitely. For one, design science in building systems. The other one would be human-computer interaction or computer-human interaction or social computing. And in fact, many discourses, including psychology and social psychology, are getting into social computing. So it's really important to know with whom are you actually trying to communicate because their constructs are going to be different. The problems that they care about are going to be different. So on a high level, this may seem simple. Are you trying to have a meaningful conversation with a particular discourse or intersection of discourses in mind? This is actually harder than it sounds because you need to really know your discourse to be able to do this. So do you know why the topic you want to study matters to the people you're trying to converse with? Do you know the key theories, the concepts, the constructs, the frameworks, the paradigms, the assumptions, the disputes, the controversies? Do you know the history and the intellectual traditions behind these artifacts of theory? What kinds of contributions are valued in this discourse? So in computer science, we want to see better algorithms. In information systems, we might want to see better IT governance. These are very different goals. And so you're going to have very different conversations depending on the discourse you're going into. Now, the other key thing is to really know how the discourse you're entering or trying to enter is different from other ones. And do you know the weaknesses of the theories? How models are applied or paradigms or frameworks? Do you know how to make a contribution in the discourse? Because contributions are made differently as far as what is valued. So this is where trying to have a meaningful conversation is quite a difficult choice and an important choice that informs theory building and all of our subsequent empirical work. So this is a representation when you know with whom you're having a conversation and you're prepared and you understand their frame of references, you can have an engaged, meaningful conversation and an interchange that is two-way. Because this is actually the paradigm or the model we should be following in science. Through peer review, through our presentations, we are engaging in written and oral conversations with each other. So it's really important for a meaningful conversation to come in prepared, to know how to persuade the people you're talking to that what you're talking about is important and may change theory, research, practice, and so forth. But there is a serious problem here. Again, it may seem simple, but it's actually a common problem. Have you ever been on this date? Well, I think we can all relate to conversations where we end up having a soliloquy, where we're talking to ourselves and we find ourselves wandering off and we're not having an engaged conversation and people lose interest. Now, this is a very common problem in scientific research, especially because of the huge volume of peer review publications that are getting out. Too many people are having conversations with themselves that no one is actually interested in at all, even though you are interested. Your goal needs to be to engage and capture the interest in the discourse you're engaging in. So one of the key flaws here is to drive what's important in theory building and concepts around gap spotting literature reviews. So this is the common key mistake because this is usually coming up with a made up conversation that you think is important, but may not be at all to the present discourse. To understand this a little bit more philosophically, we need to go back to the origination of journals. And let's go to the very first journal that was ever published back in 1665. And this is the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. This is the oldest, longest running journal in the world. Now, literally, when this journal started back in the day, in the 1600s, philosophers of science or scientists would literally write each other very lengthy, thoughtful, carefully construed letters with long, lengthy rebuttals and reactions and so forth. So eventually, some of these luminaries realize, wow, these elaborate letters we've been writing back and forth, they actually may be value outside of this small discourse, this small conversation that we're handling. So what we should do, let's bundle them together. And let's do this as a Royal Society. Yeah, we'll call it the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. So this is how journals began, as highly engaged, very thoughtful conversations back and forth. This is the model I would like to impress on you today. So let's jump forward much later in the journal's history to 1671, volume 6. You find a really interesting transaction. This is a letter literally written from Sir Isaac Newton. And the way these were set up is a little bit different now, of course, than our current peer-reviewed journals, but because these were set up as letters, because this is where they had their foundation. And so, for example, in this article, it starts off as a letter of Mr. Sir Isaac Newton, professor of the mathematics in the University of Cambridge, as containing his new theory about light and colors, sent by the author to the publisher from Cambridge, February 6, 1671, in order to be communicated to the Royal Society. And then what would happen is people would write elaborate responses back, and the good ones would then go into this journal. So this is where peer review and this peer conversation and discourse was born. Unfortunately, by modern times, especially with modern PhD student training, we've forgotten often that the whole point is engaging in a conversation with people in our discourse who care. Unfortunately, a lot of students are trained to essentially have an imaginary conversation, maybe with hand puppets with themselves. And again, this is what happens when you gap spot literature reviews and you're actually not thinking about the current issues and whom you're trying to target your conversation. So rather than hand puppets, we actually need to be thinking about key people, not just papers, but who are the people we're actually trying to influence, who have written papers or who are in discourses we're trying to influence. That's a different way to look at it, because the other point of this is that a lot of these people should be the reviewers or editors, and they're people who should read the work. So is what you're saying respectful and thoughtful? Is it building and contributing to where, like Sir Isaac Newton or these great luminaries, they'll say, oh, well, that's a good point. I will change my theory or change the way I'm doing things. Or are we having obtuse hand puppet conversations that might actually be offensive to people, actual real people out there who may see our work? So again, it's crucial that we figure out our target interdisciplinary discourse. Let me show you an illustration of how to think through this. A lot of PhD students and younger researchers are getting into sustainability. It's a huge growing discourse, but it's a very interdisciplinary discourse. So a really great way to look at it or to consider your discourses would be through a simple Venn diagram. So for example, we could look at social science discourse, environmental science, and economic science discourses, and we can look at how these intersect. So if we are looking at the intersection between the social and the economic, we might be more interested in a discourse around equity. What's equitable economically for society? Now, if we're looking at a discourse between the environment and the social, we might be looking at, well, what is bearable? What can society bear that relates to the environment? The intersection between economics and environment would be about the viability of this intersection. Now, if we were to take all of these discourses and intersect them, many would argue this is the discourse of sustainability. So we're looking at three major discipline inputs from a bearability, an equitability, and a viability standpoint in terms of how we do things that are sustainable with the environment, economics, and society in mind. So this is an example. So you can have very different conversations depending on the piece of the Venn diagram that you're entering or the actual interdisciplinary discourse. Okay, so I may have convinced you that finding your discourse and entering it and having a good conversation is important, but how? How do we do this? So how to do this well? I think one great frame of reference to use, especially for interdisciplinary researchers who work in the sciences of the artificial, is to essentially embrace design kinds of thinking. So defining and ideating, prototyping, testing, empathizing. These design skills that we used actually work quite well for theory building, especially if we can break key components or artifacts of theory down and understand them, and then use these components as building blocks to design a theory in a creative manner, just as we would design a system. So of course, when we design systems, there's all kinds of parts to systems, and you can model these and you can give them names, such as software architecture or the document and interfaces and design classes and test designs and data models. This is an example of design thinking for building systems, but we can think the same kind of way in building theory so that we give it more of a structured process, yet we can be creative at the same time. Okay, so this leads to the next important question. Well, what are these components or what are these design artifacts of theory that we need to be aware of? And how do we create these artifacts? And how do we know if we have good artifacts or bad artifacts? This, my friends, if you can master, is the key to the highest impact, highest breakthrough theorization that leads to not just original theory, but breakthrough empirical work. What I'm going to emphasize and teach to you generally was not likely taught in your statistics courses or your standard methodology courses. In these courses, you were likely taught a very confusing and inaccurate approach to science that actually has created likely some issues for you. The typical approach in a statistics or methods class is we think of a problem, we want to solve, we review the literature, we create some hypotheses, we test them, we confirm or reject the hypotheses. And so this is a very simple, very waterfall approach to theorizing. And it's actually dangerous and misleading. So So your statistics professors, yeah, these are nutty professors when it comes to learning actual science. It's great for statistics, but not good for science or theory building because this is not how good science happens. Good science is more like good design. It's iterative. It starts and stops. It comes in pieces. You go back and forth. It is not a waterfall approach. There's no way you will have your theory figured out at the beginning unless you're doing superficial theorizing where you just grab a theory and decide to hypothesize around it and collect data, which is probably what you're taught in many of these courses. And that is not the way to, to create breakthrough theory. So yes, what I'm going to tell you may seem as blasphemy to your statistics professor, who often has stringently taught, oh, you must know the theory fully ahead of time before you go through this process and before you can even create hypotheses, or you're just making it up. But this is not how real science works because we need the observations, we need the serendipity, we need the pilot tests, we need the aha moments and to go back. And it doesn't go top to bottom sequential. And if we try that approach, it doesn't lend to very good results. So from a statistics course perspective, theory is often this superficial thing that represents the idea you're testing, or it represents something you just shop for from the literature. Oh, I think I want to do the theory of reason action. Oh, or I want to do the theory of planned behavior. Or even worse, theory is often talked about as a dark art, that only the great minds, only the great luminaries create theory. The rest of us, we just shop theories that are already created. Well, this isn't scientific, and that doesn't lead to good breakthrough thinking or results. A similar kind of approach you might get in some PhD seminars or recall where you had a great luminary who really knew all these dark, beautiful mysteries, but he or she kind of kept it to himself, herself, and this was just something that you needed to appreciate and behold their great genius, their great creative powers, but to not actually teach you a structured process that you could follow like design thinking to create similarly beautiful ideas and breakthrough thinking. But again, this is wrong. This is not necessary. It's not this dark art. It's not something only the great geniuses and their beautiful minds can create. There are artifacts of theory. There are ways to create these artifacts in a structured manner that allows for creativity, but also allows you to make a structured contribution and to engage in the discourse and make a contribution to that discourse that they find to be interesting so that you're not having an uninteresting conversation with yourself. So let's start with these artifacts. I'm going to create an oval that I'm going to fill out in this presentation. And I'm going to start with one of the first artifactual components of theory. And that is one of the most important artifacts of theory, and that is the question. Now here, you don't want to confuse this with research question per se. This is your disciplinary question. So this is a question that addresses an object of study as a problem that requires a solution based on the field's or the discourse's rules of discourse and pattern of inquiry. Now, questions are really important. A discipline, more than any other aspect, whether interdisciplinary or not, is defined by the set of questions it asks. not the methods, not even the theories, not even the constructs or the paradigms, but a discipline is defined by the set of questions it asks. So a disciplinary question is one that addresses an object of study as a problem requiring a solution based on that discourse. So we need to look into the nature of the question. If it's an economic question, then you use economic principles, methods, tools, and resources to address the question. Now, what you want to ask yourself is the question that I'm asking actually a question that would be interesting and that is unanswered in this conversation? So you're having a conversation with Sir Isaac Newton. What questions make sense to him that are not answered? So this helps point to when we think of actual people we're trying to communicate with, what are these questions? And it's important that a good question, a good interdisciplinary question in a discourse that you're targeting is one that's not being asked by other disciplines or other discourses, or that they're incapable of answering, or that they don't want to ask or answer. Now, in considering these, we need to make sure that, well, sure, there's a lot of questions not being asked and that others are not capable of asking, but they're not good questions. So we're also looking at a contribution in this discourse. So ideally, science exists to make things better for the earth, for humans, for animals, or for the solar system or whatever. And so we need to look at how, if we were to be able to answer the question that we're raising in the discourse, would answering that question solve a major problem? And would people in the discourse, whether in practice or in science, would they appreciate the solution? Should they know about it? Or would they roll their eyes and say, well, yeah, we know that. Or, oh, well, that's obvious, or that's trivial, that's made up. These questions are very important to ask and address and think about before you invest heavily in any discursive questioning. So good disciplinary questions that are not being asked by others and that could solve important problems that people in the discourse are interested in, that leads to good questions overall that you can turn into research questions. Okay, so now I'd like to give an illustration of interdisciplinary questions or our discourse questions and how they matter. A great example is Emile Durkheim. In the late 1800s, he was a French sociologist. He, along with Karl Marx and Max Weber, created this new discipline called sociology. And a lot like current interdisciplinary fields and discourses, it didn't have a lot of respect. And people were wondering, well, what is this? And is this legitimate at all? Because the key discipline it was said to compete with at the time was psychology. Emil Durkheim was interested in the social problem of suicide. At the time, psychologists who focused on cognition basically theorized, well, people commit suicide because they see someone do it and they just kind of copycat and follow them. He intuitively felt that his new discipline of sociology could answer this problem in a different way. So here, sociology would ask a different disciplinary question about suicide than would psychology. So more true to science and not true to your statistics professor, he wasn't quite sure what the answer was. He didn't start with a theory, he just knew that there could be some really good social explanations. So what Emil Durkheim did is he mapped out, he topologized the pattern of suicides throughout France. And he topologized and tried to make sense of it and organize it of what the circumstances were and various descriptive things. So like a lot of great scientists and great breakthrough theorizing, he started with just organizing things, creating topologies, taxonomies. And from that, then that initial data, then things started to connect and he could theorize from this. And this gave great legitimacy to sociology and became foundational to other social sciences because what he discovered by looking at his mapping of these suicides and trying to figure out patterns and how to describe it, he came up with 4 types of suicide. And this is actually still very informative to modern day. So, and he created a simple 2 by 2 matrix of this from which he further theorized. But he basically said there are 4 types of suicide. You can look at those in blue in modern industrial societies, and you can look at those in the orangish color in traditional non-industrial societies. And he looked at this in terms of first, egoistic suicide, which is when people are feeling alone, alienated, depressed, and they lack social integration. That is the upper left quadrant. And you have anomic suicide where individuals, they're not regulated by norms and values of the group or social order. They have too little regulation. Maybe they live on the street. Maybe they don't have family. And then another kind of suicide is altruistic suicide. And this was a very controversial notion that still holds today. And this is the idea that bonds between groups are too strong so that individuals sacrifice themselves. So there's too much integration into norms and values. So this holds today to explain why people might go so far as to commit suicide for a cause, from everything from terrorism for a cause or as a form of protest, so self-emulation to bring notice to a cause. And finally, fatalistic suicide, this is where norms of society, they oppress too much and stifle individuals. So too much regulation by rules of society. So perhaps, for example, a monk that feels oppressed in his beliefs and wants to strike out against that. Now, this leads to another falsehood that we've often been taught in our schooling, and that's that there is no such thing as a stupid question. Well, I have to say that is false, especially in terms of our discourse. There are bad questions. There are wrong questions. There are questions that have been answered or not interesting or important. And so this actually really does matter because questions tie to problems and we want meaningful, interesting problems in our discourse. Okay, so what are bad questions? Well, basically questions that are not actually ever asked or answered or answerable, questions that have yes, no answers, questions whose answers don't produce any new knowledge or knowledge that is of interest to the people you're trying to have a conversation with. So you're conversing with Sir Isaac Newton, but you're conversing with him about particle physics, which maybe he's not interested in or doesn't have expertise. Questions that don't have a symmetry of outcome, that, that are too broad or too narrow, or questions that have built-in presumptions. These are not good questions. So another way we can look at this is in terms of things that are not empirical, they're not testable. So not really scientific questions, so they're more ethical or philosophical questions. So should abortion be legal? Uh, is it okay to have capital punishment? Those aren't really scientific questions. Or just general topics about sexuality or things that are highly descriptive, or sets of variables are not really questions. Vague, ambiguous, too broad of questions, such as do police make things worse in society, right? That's just too broad. Or what can we do to make the family happier? Too broad, not specific enough. So good research questions, if you look at exploratory questions, um, for example, has the incidence of new forms of child abuse appeared in Minnesota in the last 20 years? Or more specific descriptive questions. Is child abuse more common in families that have experienced a messy divorce versus never divorced families? Or explanatory questions, which we tend to associate often more with theory, but all of these can have a theoretical base. But explanatory questions. There's a lack of funds for preventative treatments for cancer. Is that a key cause for subsequent medical complications? So getting more specific and getting into the context helps us create better research questions. So as Albert Einstein says, learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow. The important thing is to not stop questioning and to ask good questions and to be inquisitive. This is part of the circle of science and the iterative nature of it. And part of the skill set we have to learn is we might think we have a great problem and a great question. And as we start to engage in the discourse, we realize, oh, it's not very good and they're not very interested. We need to drop those and to move on. And so we really have to have that self-critical ability to observe when a question actually is not as good as we thought it was. So final parting thought on questions. If all else fails, think of being an investigative reporter and break things into the context. How, why, what, who, where, when. Start thinking about these various aspects and the kinds of conversations that are being had, and then you can break this down into more interesting questions. Now, the next artifact of theory I want to talk about is what is commonly called a concept. A concept is an abstract idea that's only in our heads, but the problem with concepts, they rarely are that great for good theorizing in of themselves because they're often too abstract or too specific to be useful. So for example, blue is a concept, sadness is a concept, but these aren't necessarily that interesting. So formally, concepts are mental representations or generalized abstractions that people make. They're often based on experience or learned or socially shared. And so these are socially selectively constructed often. Concepts can actually involve real phenomena such as cat, wind, pain, teacher, architecture, easy, hard, rocket, light. Or concepts can be about phenomena with which there's agreement or disagreement, such as truth, beauty, social justice, prejudice, human rights, values, ethics, human worth. Crucially, they're not directly measurable, and thus serious problems can occur if you try to operationalize concepts directly without following a systematic process involving proper creation of constructs and measures in terms of concept validity, construct validity, and so forth. However, we don't want to be dismissive of concepts. Concepts are important, of course, or I wouldn't be mentioning them as an artifact of theory. The, probably the most important role of concepts is they're abstract ideas that we have out there that we're trying to piece together, and they can be seeds of inspiration for constructs. Now, constructs are generally what we're seeking for when we're seeking to build key artifacts of theory, and I'll explain why. But before moving to constructs, I want to give you a couple of examples and representations of ways to think about abstract concepts. So this is a really nice illustration where there's examples of different kinds of concepts. So numbers are concepts, or moral aesthetics, or sociality, or emotions. And these tend to have a grounding, so maybe in sociality or in language or in our interpretation or metacognition or perceptions. So we can lay out these various concepts to try to get an understanding, well, where did these come from? What are they grounded in? How were these learned? Like what does a number mean to me and where did it come from? Now, this is another interesting illustration about concepts, another way to think of them. This is an illustration by Sarah Major that shows right brain vehicles for learning left brain concepts. So color coding, writing and illustration, gesture body motion, global whole, picture image, metaphor, music, rhyme, rhythm, story, graphic organizer, acting as right brain vehicles for left brain concepts. Now, one other interesting way to think about concepts or work with them that I've seen used quite a bit, and Andy Van de Ven, University of Illinois, promoted this quite a bit. And this was popularized by Tony Buzan. And this is the use of mind maps. And this is a tool that records knowledge and mental systems around a central theme. So this often breaks into concepts and helps us organize how concepts might relate to each other. So using mind maps to better understand these highly abstract representations can be very helpful in initial early theorizing. But in terms of artifacts of theory, constructs are immensely important. And it's key that we understand these. And part of understanding these, we need to think about three things that can be measured. The first thing that we can measure are direct observables. These are characteristics of a subject or from the natural environment that can be directly observed or measured objectively. So speed, height, weight, color. Natural sciences deal with a lot of direct observables. Interdisciplinary sciences of the artificial, we don't have a lot of these, and these tend to not be that interesting. Indirect observables are typically verifiable characteristics that can be provided by someone via questionnaire or can be confirmed by formal records, but they tie back indirectly to things that could theoretically be systematically and objectively observed. So these are things like gender, age, income, place of birth, place of employment, citizenship, personal address of employment, religion, so on and so forth. Again, not that interesting. These are things we need to ask, but usually for demographic purposes, for controls. But direct observables and indirect observables are rarely very important or interesting in terms of science and especially in interdisciplinary fields. The third class of things that can be measured are what we are most interested in here, and these are constructs. Now, constructs are hypothetical creations of humans that are inspired from observations, inspired by concepts, or inspired by theory, but which cannot be observed either directly or indirectly and may be entirely in a human's mind, and thus require surrogate measurement later on to try to reveal their nature, which leads to the crucial scientific issues of content and construct validity. And this is where theory and method are bridged, is with content and construct validity. Okay, but how is a construct different than a concept? This is one of the most fundamentally important things in better developing theory, is getting these separate. So basically, these are concepts that are a little less abstract than concepts, that are contextualized to our discourses, that are closer to measurement. So they tend to not be variables. They still have a level of abstraction, but they can be talked about in terms of levels and increases and relationships to other constructs. So some good example high-level constructs would be intelligence, satisfaction, strategic advantage, strategic alignment, IT governance, flow, enjoyment, interactivity. And then you further contextualize these down depending on what you are working with. So maybe enjoyment is too high level. Maybe you want enjoyment in meeting processes or enjoyment of the system adoption process or something very specific like that. Now, finally, variables, importantly, which we learn in stats classes, variables are operationalized constructs, and these are composed at different levels or values. So actual tests of IQ as a surrogate for intelligence. So intelligence would be the construct, an IQ test would be the operationalization to represent or to be a surrogate for intelligence, which we can never fully know, and we're trying to get close to. So a key point I want to very strongly emphasize here is this connection between concepts, which could be represented by the light bulb in the person's head, and constructs represented by the construction worker, and the actual measures or variables. So basically, constructs sit in the middle. They're the bridge between your most abstract ideas or concepts to your most operationalized and least abstract, which are the measures or the variables. Constructs are the theoretical glue. This is where the creativity occurs. This is where we contextualize and get into the key components that our discourse is interested in terms of the problems and questions. So they come out of there. Okay, turning to our next artifact of theory is myth. Now, traditionally, we understand myth to be a traditional story, especially one that's concerning the early history of a people or something that explains a natural or social phenomena. And it typically involves supernatural beings or events. Now, that's not exactly what we generally mean in terms of myth in artifacts of theory. A more pragmatic definition of myth in our context would be a widely held but false belief or idea. Now, this is really important in interdisciplinary research because we're so tightly tied to practice. Practice, regardless of our discipline, is a wonderful source to find myth or widely held but false beliefs or ideas. These myths can serve as great motivators for research, and we can counter myths or build on them. But also, these myths often point to really good archetypal problems or patterns of problems that we see over and over. So there's a lot of myths out there, technology related especially, because there's a lot of hype related to technology. So, and in fact, a lot of ideas are built on a myth and a metaphor together. So a good example of this is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is both a metaphor and a myth because there is no intelligence involved. Cloud computing, same idea. It's both a metaphor and a myth. So the mythical nature of this is, of course, we're not working in a cloud. Other examples include the paperless office, work-life balance, and so forth. So we might be getting some handle on the paperless office, but nonetheless, we have not done away with printers. Offices are replete with Xerox machines and so forth. And in fact, technology has increased our use of paper. So why is that? What's the conflict? What's the problem? This is where myths can be very helpful. And of course, the myth and metaphor of artificial intelligence, when in fact, these are computational techniques. There is no intelligence. It's becoming more intelligence-like, so it seems, but simply through better algorithms, faster processing, more memory, and so forth. And much of what we do in AI, ironically, is of a brute force nature. So the cloud myth and metaphor is important to denote because sure, it is true that computers are connected more than ever, and we have the Internet of Things, which adds billions, hundreds of billions of new devices that are networked. But the backbone of all of this is not wireless. That's usually at the very end on the consumer side. But the high speed connections are still all wired. And this is basically through high speed fiber optic lines. So this is what goes to server farms, what goes under the ocean to connect countries. And this is the high speed backbone in every country. So there is no cloud. It's actually highly physical. So given myths can often overlap with metaphor and serve as both, this is a good time to introduce a key artifact of theory, metaphor. Metaphors are wonderful for conveying information. So definition you probably learned in terms of writing is that a metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it's not literally applicable. Now, another way to look at this more abstractly is a metaphor is something that represents or is symbolic of something else, especially something abstract. Now, both these definitions work pretty well in theory building, but it's this second definition, this whole idea of abstraction and simplification that's actually foundational to all of theory building, because theory is all about that. It's about metaphor, it's about abstraction, it's about simplifying. It's not about precision and the exact knowledge of the truth. It's about approximations and simplifying and modeling and doing representations that we can process. So this idea of metaphor is inherent to the whole philosophy around theorizing. So I want to close with an example of good, beautiful, powerful theory and how it can change the world with the discovery of the double helix by Watson and Crick between 1951 and 1953. Now, there's actually a lot more to the story, and there's controversy and people that didn't receive credit and so forth, as is the case in science. But what's important here for our purposes today was how profoundly beautiful and elegant the double helix discovery was. Because up until this time, scientists were racking their brains how exactly it was that chromosomes and genes are formed and how to represent them and how they're stored and so forth. And they thought of this physical model of the double helix, which is what resolved the issue. So the model, this artifact of theory of the double helix, was hugely important to their theory, their broader theory of trying to understand how genes control chemical processes within cells, the bigger theory. Now, by applying this model to the theory, it allowed them to help launch modern molecular biology. And think of the implications of this for mankind. This theory, the associated models, the assumptions, all these other artifacts that Watson and Crick and many others were involved in doing, it's led to amazing breakthroughs in genetic engineering for microbiology, modern virology, modern medicine, forensics, so many different advances in science, the Human Genome Project. We can thank them and for these many interdisciplinary discourses for applying good artifacts of theory. And okay, so at this point with the example of the double helix metaphor and how inspirational it was for Crick and Watson and subsequent research, I'm going to take a break and end this part of the video lecture series. And the second part will continue with metaphors, and I'll give some other examples as to why these are important. And so much of it is because storytelling is really our most powerful tool. Then I'm going to complete the other artifacts of theory, starting with analogy, paradigm, hypothesis, statement, law, framework, model, and finally, we're back in the full circle, back to question. Okay, so as we close this part, just wanted to leave with some visuals showing the power of storytelling across cultures. And I will also end with credits for this work, and then this will continue on in the next video slide series. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this was helpful.